So, the guest for today's episode does his research on a topic that has captivated my imagination and piqued my interest for as long as I can remember now. Now, I've always been fascinated by cultural and traditional mores that vary from country to country. And for a country as big as the United States, these cultural differences can, I guess, vary from state to state, right? But there seems to be another way some amongst us, I guess, interface with their environment. Now, they fall into these alternate realities where incidents that the rest of us might attribute to happenstance, right? And just the random nature of the universe, they seek to quote unquote connect the dots and prove that what the rest of us might call chance, right, is really the handiwork of some nefarious actors in sometimes upper echelons of society and politics, right? Now, there's no shortage of these, I guess, cockamamie stories, if I may say, right? From the QAnon phenomenon that has really swept across the United States to, I guess, old world tales about how, I guess, wealthy Jewish families like the Rothschilds control world banking. Now, these ones tend to have a special perniciousness to them. So, in my point of view, um, they have their roots in anti-Semitic canards, right? So, with all that said, I'd like to introduce my interlocutor for today's episode. So, we have Michael Biddlestone with us. Michael is a postgraduate researcher and associate lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of Kent. So, welcome, Michael.
Hi, Idris. Thanks so much for having me on. It's
All
a
right,
pleasure to
perfect.
be here. Great intro as well.
Good to have you. So, to start, I'd like to, hear what led you into this, I guess, much criticized and less envied world of research. So if you can just give us, I guess, the lowdown on how you came about to be a researcher. So if you can go through your undergraduate work, your graduate work, and what led you to this very interesting topic of research, which would be conspiracy theories.
Sure, that's a good way to put it. I guess, I mean, I can't say that I had a plan when I was young, to be a researcher or anything. I guess what I would say is, in a general sense, I really enjoyed just doing research in my undergraduate and things like that. But in terms of researching conspiracy theories, I've always been interested in basically the weird or things that would kind of go against what you would assume, So I guess I've been brought up in a family and in a society or in a social environment where I don't tend to see everything as suspicious, and to encounter people who kind of assume that everything is suspicious, that there's always someone behind something, is basically just counterintuitive to me. And those things are, basically what really interests me, things that I wouldn't have thought of myself. And those are definitely conspiracy theories. And in that sense, I think a conspiracy theorist would say I'm naive, I lack skepticism and things like that, which, maybe I can accept. There's always either side of the continuum or whatever. But that's what I would say is basically, yeah, anything that's counterintuitive, a bit weird, a bit out there, someone that I would like to talk to at a party for a long time, that I didn't know existed, that kind of thing.
Wow, very interesting. I'd say I share the same, I guess, flaw, if I may say, at least in the eye of the conspiracy theorist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I tend to have this nagging feeling, right, that okay, we all have a way we interface with the world, right? And how could it be that someone sees the world differently from me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is why I've actually taken an interest in this idea of conspiracy theories, right? So it'd be the easy thing to do is just to write it off, right, and say, okay, these are just crazies, right? But
Mm-hmm.
you would notice that some of the people that actually believe in these stories are functioning individuals like you and me, have families, have jobs, and for the longest time, I thought it was an education issue, but going through your papers, I think it's actually much more deeper than that. So I know we're gonna talk about cognitive biases at some point in our
Mm-hmm.
conversation, right? But I'd like to, like I said, fess up about my cognitive bias about people
Sure.
who I deem to have conspiratorial tendencies. Again, I thought it was a predominantly educational situation. full stop, period. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And now, if you would have told me any other, I guess, criterion even comes close, I'd be totally incredulous, right? But in your papers, you two argue that there's far more at play than a lack of a tertiary education, right? So
Mm-hmm.
can you just start us off with that? So set the
Sure.
stage for our conversation.
Of course, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So basically, our colleagues at the University of Kent, our supervisors, Karen Douglas, Robbie Sutton, and Alexandra Chehotska specifically, they have this paper where they basically discuss a general theoretical framework for the motivations that lead to conspiracy beliefs. Mm. So these are divided into three distinct categories. These are basically existential motives. So that's things that kind of make you feel anxious, that your life is being upturned, that something disastrous is happening to you. Or there's relational motives, which are essentially social motives, these things that are about your groups, about how you see yourself, how you feel about your self-worth. And then the third one is epistemic motives, which are things like you said, cognitive biases, basically these kind of cold cognitive processes that don't tend to have this emotional feel to them, but they change the lens in which we see the world, right? So what I would say there is that, yes, education has been shown to be, low education, I should say, is linked to conspiracy beliefs in the sense of perhaps, low scientific literacy rather than intelligence per se, but the research is still early on that, basically. But the idea here is that, like you said, it's not just education. It's about our emotions. It's this kind of unconscious thing that we don't realize we're doing. So we have this term in psychology, which is motivated reasoning. And an example of this is when, for example, you vote Democrat versus Republican. Sometimes you can see reality in a different way, right? You have a different interpretation of these kind of tending to be relatively ambiguous events, or sometimes not even ambiguous. They have a completely different reading of the situation, regardless of their education, right? Education can play at this, but a very important part is your motivations. And your motivations are basically to, to maintain your understanding of the world so that it's coherent and so that it feels like it makes sense, okay? So it's kind of comfortable for you. So in that sense, what I would say is that when your motivations are not satisfied, you can often reach out to conspiracy beliefs in order to supposedly satisfy these unsatisfied motivations, right? So if you're confused about the world, maybe a conspiracy theory will help you make sense of your circumstances or the world, as an example.
Wow, interesting. So for the past, I'd say, few months now, I've actually been interested in this idea of a simulation, right? So in a way, we're all living in our own simulations, right? That are shaped by, I guess, the background epistemological assumptions we make of the world as a result of, our upbringing, our culture, and traditions, right? So I'd say that has a way of molding how we interface with the world. Is that what you're saying as well?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is that there is this broad universal aspect to motivations, right? All humans seem to have this kind of existential reaction. But you're absolutely right. There's a societal level thing, which is essentially, for example, if there's inequality in society, if you feel relative deprivation compared to other groups, you might be driven to make sense of this by using conspiracy theories. That being said, there's more inequality in some societies than others. So yeah, exactly what you're saying, some societies would have different routes to conspiracy theories. And on that as well, I can see that you're kind of touching on the cultural aspect, which we can talk about later. But there may be these are also these kind of social learning things in certain societies, or norms and the ways that people act that can bring out or not bring out these reactions, or basically make you feel like your motivations are not satisfied, like I mentioned, and therefore you turn to conspiracy theories.
All right. So just to summarize, so the motives that drive conspiratorial thinking can, I guess, be characterized as epistemic, existential, and social, right?
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So let's go in depth on epistemology, right? So how we know what we know. Now, I've always argued that the antidote for conspiratorial thinking is expertise, right? Now, this might explain why I've, I guess, always thought that the problem was always an educational one rather than anything else, right? So whenever anyone tries to pass on some cockamamie story to me, the first question I ask is, what are your qualifications to actually discuss this matter in the first place, right? So is this a good heuristic to have?
I guess, yeah. I mean, in a more specific way, I think it's
Yeah.
more, you could maybe say about their cognitive style, right? Rather than, so what the expertise kind of gives people is this cognitive style that they've acquired over the years, right? So for example, you know, you study one thing at university as a one specific example. What they tend to do is try to teach you how to think in a certain way, to see the world through that lens of that subject. So in that sense, I would say, yes, it's about, you know, expertise, but sometimes these things are aside from expertise as well, you know? So for example, you know, I might just feel more comfortable with certain cognitive biases because they serve me in my life, right? So if I prefer to see the world in a way from its meaning rather than, you know, its causes. So for example, we call it teleological thinking, where basically you say, this event was big, therefore there must have been something else happening behind it, right? That might be something that's influenced by your social life in terms of maybe your family upbringing. Maybe that's just a way that they taught you how to think, or, you know, that's how maybe a subject that you're interested in, for example, New Age ideas, things like that, spirituality might lead people to think in this way, you know, because it's you're kind of practicing how to see the world in this cognitive style, basically. So yeah, I would say in that sense.
Well, you know, I've always argued that, you know, even if you can't get, you know, a formal tertiary education, I'd say things like philosophy kind of helps with, I guess, at least elucidating issues when it comes to falling into cognitive traps, right? And in logical fallacies, right?
Of course,
So,
yeah.
for example, let's look at climate change, right? So, for me, if you had the background, right? So the scientific background in basic physics. So things like, you know, heat transfer and I guess Wien's law, what else? The Stefan Boltzmann black body radiation laws. It makes understanding the science of, the greenhouse effect a bit more palatable, right? A bit more understandable. So that's why I have always, I guess, fallen into that cognitive bias that, okay, it might be an educational problem.
Sure. No, that makes total sense. Yeah, because, you know, it fits. If you don't understand this stuff, then this information doesn't really fit with how you make sense of the world. If you do understand that stuff, it does fit. So you don't need to seek other explanations, right? That's basically what you're describing as well, I would say, yeah.
All right. So then there's the existential motive, right? So now, is it correct to, I guess, bring in theology into this as well? So I imagine most of our Abrahamic religions come about at a time when human beings faced, you know, tremendous tumult, right? So just as how the tumult of 2020 has brought about, you know, a new crop of conspiracy theories or conspiratorial thinking, right? So where do you see theology in this argument, or is this something you guys actually look at, or is it something you've thought of in the past?
We tend to measure religiosity, which is about, you know, your level of religiousness rather than what religion you are, for example. But to be fair, we don't necessarily hypothesize that religiosity is what we look at to predict conspiracy beliefs. What we do is we call controlling for that statistically, right? So what we say is that alongside our hypotheses, we're also going to take into account the effect of religiosity to make sure it's not just about that, right? However, of course, there's a comparison to be made there in terms of the way that you construct, the way that you interact with the world in terms of knowledge. As I mentioned before, teleological thinking is like, you know, seeing the world through its meaning rather than through its actual causes and stuff. So what I would say is that I think that I would argue that religion is a similar outcome, like conspiracy beliefs, to this existential concern, right? Which is that, for example, I am worried that I may die and nothing will happen after I die. So therefore, there's this nice idea that I can subscribe to, which kind of explains that in a way which is much nicer and much easier to comprehend and for me to come to terms with, you know, a religion, which is essentially how conspiracy theories work as well. They make you feel more comfortable about the world because you can make sense of it. You can, it's what you assumed was correct, you know, this kind of stuff. It gives a reason for everything when sometimes things are just random or chance, like you mentioned earlier. Yeah, but this existential dread, I think, is a complicated thing because, you know, it has a lot of factors within it. So there's this societal effect of, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic. What is our world going to mean now? What do I do? Am I going to lose my job? How are my family going to die? All of these existential dreads. There's also this kind of more dispositional side to that, which is that, for example, people's attachment styles, Ricky does research on this, people's attachment styles can alter the way they interact with these existential concerns as well. So, for example, he's found that they are likely to see the world in a more extreme way, possibly, if they're anxiously attached, this kind of thing. So there is, what I mean is there's this societal side to the existential, and there's this kind of dispositional side to it in that sense, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, because I've always tried to see if there's a nexus point between religion and conspiracies, right? So, again, going back to 5,000 BC, when some of these Abrahamic religions are actually starting to pop up, right? And again, that's a time when human beings, they look at the world and, they see pain, they see suffering, right? They see death. And it'll make sense for them to adhere to these overarching, theological philosophies, right? So I would argue that religion might have a hard time, I guess, getting a foothold today as it did, back then. Right.
Absolutely. I would agree with that, possibly. Yeah. I mean, at this point, it's hard to say without, precise research on it, but I would absolutely agree. And, since the Enlightenment, there's been a shift, of course, in terms of how humans on a societal level accept information, and accept information. And what they kind of consider as the way to search for truth. Right. Yeah. So it's much less about religion now. But I think what you're kind of touching on again is, this thing that existential feeling is still there. We still need to make a meaning of the world, right? It may be that, this is again speculation, it may be that shift towards an enlightenment is now meaning that conspiracy theories may replace religion.
Wow, right? Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
So it's like we never had the Enlightenment then.
This
idea that we need to do away with religion and go with reason, right? So induction over deduction. Right.
Exactly.
It'd be a shame if we lose that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
So we know people are just naturally bad at understanding randomness, right? So the stochastic nature of the universe. I'd say I have that problem too. So sitting in a probabilities class, right? It's, you look at some of these concepts and you think, okay, how is that even possible, right? So I remember just this election we had, and there's still debate on, okay, for some people they still think the President Trump actually won the election, and they ask questions like, well, how do we know who won the election on the election night, right? But then someone who's actually well versed in statistics and probabilities, you would know that you actually don't need to count all the votes in certain precincts to actually determine who won an election, right?
Exactly.
So things like that make, I wouldn't say it makes intuitive sense, but at least you understand the concepts behind it. So it's easier for you to accept, the results of an election as opposed to someone who actually doesn't really understand probabilities, right?
And it may not even be that they don't understand the probabilities, it's that they are selectively forgetting them, right? So back on that cognitive bias thing, there's the selection bias that can sometimes happen, which is they're recalling the information which is convenient for them at that time. Essentially, what that is the motivated reasoning again, is that they are only thinking about the information that would mean they don't understand how it couldn't be a conspiracy, right? Because it must be that there was a conspiracy there for Trump to have lost, So therefore, their brain then kind of works in a backwards logic way to go, well, it must be this, and it can't be that this probability information is relevant anymore,
Sure. All right. So I guess there's a sad aspect to all this, right? So there's a paradox when it comes to conspiratorial thinking, to allay your fears on that stems from, the existential threats that you might perceive that are coming your way, right? So it actually does the opposite thing, right? So the more you get into conspiracies, actually, the more you lose a sense of autonomy and even control, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, you almost explained it, absolutely perfectly in the way I'm going to say it. So, as I mentioned earlier, this feeling of motivations, when they're not satisfied, they tend to maybe drive you to believe conspiracy theories in order to satisfy these motivations. But like you said, for example, if I feel a lack of control, that means that my motivation for control is not satisfied. Therefore, I may believe in a conspiracy theory in order to regain control over my world, right? However, that conspiracy theory might contain an idea that malevolent forces have absolute control over my life, which now again puts me back in a position where I don't have control, right? So as you mentioned, yeah, that can be this kind of circular thing where conspiracy theories don't necessarily satisfy the motivations that they purport to satisfy, right? And in that sense, yeah, it can maybe be a downward spiral when you start to believe in them because of this reason. You know, the things that you're trying to satisfy are not being satisfied, and therefore you reach out again to try and believe in them again, and again you get the same effect, right? But of course, that's one example of control. So there may be other aspects to that, but working in a similar way, basically, yeah.
Wow, interesting. So let's talk on the social motives, right? So if there's one reason I can give someone a pass on believing in conspiracies, I'd say it's this one, right? So I guess studies have shown that ethnic groups that have been, I guess, marginalized and persecuted at some time tend to be more conspiratorial than the rest of us, right? So I'd say this kind of rings true for the African American community in the States. Now, we all know the horrors of slavery, and we can argue that, okay, you know what, that was a while back, but even recent history, so Jim Crow laws and things like the situations like the Tuskegee syphilis study. I don't know if you know anything about that.
I've heard of this, but I don't know the exact details, but I have heard of this, yeah.
So this happened earlier on in the 20th century. So about 600 or so impoverished Black men, mostly sharecroppers, they were surreptitiously enrolled in this study to see how syphilis ravages the human body, right? And so there's debate on if these men were actually infected during the study, but I think the evidence kind of pushes towards the fact that they actually contracted this disease from their personal proclivities, right? And notwithstanding, a governmental organization was behind this, right? So the Tuskegee University and the CDC, which would be the Center for Disease Control. I think it's kind of analogous to the NHS out there in the UK.
Sure, the National Health Service, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, these two organizations partook in this farce, right? Where hundreds of people actually died from it. This is actually a known fact. And these agencies have actually come out and apologized for their, partaking in this event, right? Now, all this, so slavery, Jim Crow, things like the Tuskegee syphilis study still rings true in the psyche of African Americans till today, right? So during the 1980s AIDS epidemic, right? A lot of African Americans actually thought, right, the government was behind the HIV virus, right? So whenever there's any governmental health initiatives, right, a lot of African Americans tend to be ambivalent or at least apprehensive on their motives, right? So same thing with today with the global pandemic. And we know that African Americans, due to social and economic factors, are more likely to have the comorbidities that exacerbate COVID-19, right? So I'm really terrified that a lot of people won't get vaccinated because of, this collective, apprehension of government, right? So sure. What do you think of this idea?
I mean, you articulated that really, really well. I mean, I'm actually really interested in this idea at the moment of essentially, disadvantaged groups in a general sense. But of course, you mentioned the African American community in the US, and I think that's just because it's such a salient, example, especially with the protests this year and this kind of thing, right? The BLM protests, and the idea behind this that I really find interesting is that it really speaks to this idea that maybe there is this evolutionarily adaptive reason for conspiracy beliefs, right? So the idea here is that that people are, suspicious in a rational way of certain groups, because historically we can say that the government towards the African American community in the US has been systemically treating them terribly, unfairly, essentially, war crime kind of level. So that's what, the main thing I would say about that is I think it really speaks to this idea that maybe there's an important distinction to be made, which the research hasn't really touched on yet, which is that there is this kind of rational reason to believe conspiracies as well. That being said, that does mean that at the same time, it's essentially a general lens to see the world, right? So while it's rational and while it's totally understandable and ultimately adaptive, it can backfire when it becomes this blanket view of the world, right? We call it dangerous worldview, right? So any information, anything you kind of encounter, like you said with the vaccinations, it must be that the government are doing what they've always done, right? Which is totally understandable. But in this case, it's unlikely that that is true, So yeah, that's basically what I'd like to say about that, is that I think that research really needs to uncover this kind of essentially adaptive versus maladaptive approach to why people believe conspiracy theories, right? And I think one way to tap into that is majority and minority groups in certain countries and looking at their different motivations for why they believe conspiracy theories, right? So for example, we have this concept in psychology that's really well established now called system justification. And system justification is this motivation to make sense of your society and basically defend the status quo, right? Because the kind of worry of what's going to happen if the status quo is changed is a bit, scary to humans naturally, right? So what we tend to do is maybe we justify the system. However, the general findings on system justification and conspiracy beliefs is very mixed, okay? So what I think here is that there's something to do with people who are actually challenging the system with conspiracy theories and people who are trying to justify the system with conspiracy theories. And that's something I think might be for future research to look at in terms of, like I said, the adaptive and maladaptive approaches. Because, personally, as a kind of lefty researcher, I would argue that it's really important to just challenge systems as much as possible, even if we're wrong. It's really good to challenge systems, but at the same time, not when it really negatively affects your life. It becomes a negative loop.
All right. So basically what you're saying is don't always appeal to authority, but never appeal to ignorance, right?
Basically, yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, much more articulate than me. Yeah,
no. I'm sure my listeners are gonna be swooned by your British accent. So, all right. But just to go back to a more somber note, right? So I know for a fact people are actually gonna die from COVID-19 as a result of not taking the vaccine when it's readily available, right? And this stems from, again, conspiratorial thinking. Now, I know this is more of a, I guess, a delicate topic, but how do you think governments, even with their checkered past, right? How do you think they can allay the fears of people's thinking when it comes to things like vaccine efforts?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a really difficult question. I mean, one of the issues we have in our research is we kind of stay away from explicitly looking at the interventions that we can promote for conspiracy beliefs, because it really seems like these are too embedded, right? It's really difficult to change someone's opinion when, if you give them counterfactual information, what they do instead of taking that on board is they say, of course you would say that because A, B, and C, right? You're lying to me, you're conspiring against me. So it's really difficult to know what to do. But I think what we have learned, at least, is that as conspiracy beliefs seem to be at least appealing to this motivation satisfaction factor, what we can do is maybe try and appeal to people's unsatisfied motivations, right? A lot of this is about trust. Whether people will explicitly say that or not when they believe a conspiracy theory, a lot of it is about trust, right? So what we've seen, I think in the UK and US definitely, is celebrities taking the vaccine, on film. And I think this is a really good idea. I think it's a really good way to show it because, I mean, like I said, unfortunately, a lot of people will just say this video is fake, right? But because it's also appealing to our motivations, if someone by chance is really into that celebrity that's getting the vaccine, this may bypass this kind of idea that everything's a conspiracy. And they might say, actually, I really like what that celebrity does. This must not be a conspiracy. Hopefully that's what's going to appeal to them. But ultimately, the research is not conclusive yet on this. So really, we're kind of shooting in the dark on this. Yeah. But I would say that number one is a really good one, is to kind of appeal to people's sense of celebrity worship, maybe celebrity worship. Another one I would say is that it seems like from reading things online, people, and from what you've said actually, is people basically just misunderstand the information, right? They give statistics or probabilities or information that is kind of like selective, or they clearly just don't understand the information. So this is a really simple one, but it seems to be that some of the research is uncovering this, is that if you do what's called inoculation, which is basically you give people all of the information about, in this case, vaccines, before they encounter a conspiracy theory, they've got the tools to understand why this conspiracy theory doesn't make sense when they do encounter it, right? So I know that that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to persuade people away from conspiracy theories, but it does mean maybe there's this buffer in place, which means that, you know, maybe they'll be able to encounter these conspiracy theories. Therefore, yeah, the vaccine issue won't be a problem there. And finally, Alexandra Chahotska, my supervisor, has just done a piece recently in Nature, which is about basically how the way to counteract conspiracy theories, like I've just said, is not really to try and change their opinion. It's about going through these peripheral factors. And what she argues is basically well-being. It's really simple, but if we reduce this inequality in society and we kind of nurture this feeling of well-being in people, then you know, in whatever way, maybe the adverts about vaccines, maybe the way that we appeal to people's understanding of their well-being when we try to get them to take the vaccine, you know, we really emphasize the importance of it for our well-being. Ultimately, people hopefully will feel less inclined to believe conspiracy theories because they're okay, you know, they've got no concerns. They know that they're going to be okay and happy and satisfied, basically. So yeah, in a long form, that's my answer.
Well, yeah,
it's very difficult though.
You know, the fact that we need to rely on celebrities to take a vaccine, I don't know how that just it makes me feel, you know, that we have to go through these over gratuitous lengths to convince people to actually do something that is just obviously right to do, right? Take a vaccine in a global pandemic, right? All right. Now, what I find very revealing, going back to what I just said, is this idea that if you believe in one conspiracy, you're more likely to believe in another, right? So is that how people actually fall into these rabbit holes of conspiracies? So you start with one and you find it compelling, and I guess it tickles some part in your brain that actually makes you more susceptible to believe in conspiracies. So then you just fall into, so it's a domino effect, and you just continue on, and everything becomes a conspiracy.
Basically, yeah, that's a great way to say it. So, you know, as I touched on earlier, this idea that there's like this universal part in humans, right, which is to satisfy these motivations, and therefore, you know, one conspiracy theory is just one specific context in which people try to satisfy this very universal, general sense of satisfied, you know, motivations. So, yeah, in that sense, what I would say is that once you believe one conspiracy theory, maybe that, you know, appeals to your motivations in certain ways, and you realize that that's a really effective way of having this kind of shortcut to satisfying these motivations, right? And what I would also say is that, you know, conspiracy theories also seem to be associated with just these general dangerous worldviews, or also this kind of dispositional thing like anxious attachment, like Ricky works on, meaning that basically people, they see the world through a general lens of conspiracy. They don't tend to just go, that one is a conspiracy theory, you know? That being said, I do think that most people believe in some way at least one conspiracy theory. And I think a really good example of this is the Epstein didn't kill himself conspiracy theory, right?
Sure.
And the idea here is that it was just such, JFK is another really good example, right? And it's just, there's so many gaps in the information that we have that it's very difficult for people to accept only the official narrative, right? Which means that it's just so open for other explanations. So in that sense, I would say it's when there is this genuine lack of motivation there, lack of satisfied motivation there, that people have this general belief in all conspiracy theories. But that being said, there are people that believe in one specific one just because maybe the information is very ambiguous anyway, and it's very difficult to accept that, you know, for anyone.
Yeah. So I fancy myself to be totally conspiratorially adverse, right? So even this Epstein situation, I mean, if I was to put a ratio to it, even I think maybe like 60-40, he actually didn't kill himself, right? But it just goes back to what you're saying, right? So now I know we touched on attachment theory, and I know that's the work of Ricky, right? Now,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, can we actually talk more about it? And
Sure.
if you just want to touch on what that is and how it actually affects people's line of thinking.
Yeah, so this is actually ongoing research at the moment. So,
Mm.
I can't go fully into it because, Ricky's actually writing the paper at the moment. This is Ricky
Sure.
Green at the University
Okay.
of Kent, just to be clear. Yeah.
Sure.
And so, yeah, he's basically uncovered this idea that so it's good to start here. So basically, in a general sense, people tend to fall into two general categories of having a secure attachment or an insecure attachment, right? So when you are securely attached, your model of the world in your head, how you view the world, in terms of caregivers, is very kind of. I don't want to butcher this explanation.
Sure, no
I think
problem.
what will help is if I say that. So there's securely and insecurely attached people, right? Secure attachment is associated with much fewer issues in your life, right? In terms of adaptive reactions in your life. When you are insecurely attached, there's these two distinct types of insecure attachment. There's anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. Avoidantly attached people tend to view the world in a way where they don't really trust other people. They trust themselves more than others. Sure. Whereas anxiously attached people is the reverse. They don't really trust themselves. They're more likely to seek other routes of information and things. So what Ricky has found is that anxious attachment is associated with conspiracy beliefs, while avoidant attachment is not. And he's currently looking at why this is. And it's difficult to say at the moment with, he's still analyzing the data and things, but it seems to be about the different ways that they cope with the world, right? So maybe to do with when anxiously attached people, they tend to maybe be more anxious in general, right? They're more concerned about fear and existential dread, whereas avoidantly attached people maybe just don't think about it. They don't consider it because they just avoid the issues, the existential worries. I've slightly butchered that explanation. That's basically what Ricky's working on at the moment. Is anxious attachment specifically. All
right, so these different attachment styles, we just use it to allay our fears whenever we're in distress, right? All right, so like you said, the anxious attachment is I guess the realm of conspiratorial thinking, right? So then they use these theories as, if I may say, coping mechanisms, right? To compensate for their mistrust of other people. Is that
basically
correct?
That's a good way to describe it.
All right.
Yep.
All right, so let's talk about something I actually never really knew there was a word for, and it's this idea of Manichaean worldview, right? So this idea that there's two warring factions, right, in our realm, right? So the force for good and the force for evil, right? And the force for evil is trying to usurp, everything that's good about our world and, take us back to this dystopian reality, right? So I think that's where conspiracies like the QAnon conspiracy and this idea that George Soros and like the Rothschilds are the ones behind all the ills of the world, and they're using their money to fund these nefarious actors, right? So for me, is this just a lack of critical thinking skills, or am I being a bit too harsh here?
I don't think you're being harsh, but but it's a very human thing, Basically, in very early psychology research, they call it splitting, which is basically this idea that you can't really see people as what we think of these two conflicting things, which is good and evil, right? So say someone goes to prison for theft or whatever. If someone really has a moral issue with theft, let's say, right? They are more inclined to think of that person as only a bad person, even if that person does lots of good things in their life, right? The truth is we are all good and we're all bad, we all have good elements of good and bad in us. But because it's easier for us psychologically to make these judgments and for us to also, understand the morality of the world. So what I would say in the QAnon thing as well is I think it really appeals to people's, of course, moral issues with, child abuse and things. This is a very well researched thing, is that, basically unanimously humans have a real moral issue, of course, understandably, with child abuse, which is why I think that conspiracy theory has really got its hooks into some people, because in the UK, for example, in the 90s, we had this big moral outrage about child abuse, because there was basically this kind of change in how people were perceiving it and how we should treat these people, and there's still ongoing, things like in Germany, they've got these what some people would describe as progressive approaches to child abuse. But, people criticize that a lot because they think it gives pedophiles too much of a moral grounding or something.
Sure.
But what I would say is that I think that we call it Manichaean, but I think there may be, I don't know if there's a distinction in the pronunciation of UK and US. All I'm not sure. But yeah, we tend to call it Manichaean, and it's I think it's based on that, right? It's much easier to see the world as good versus evil, and we don't like the complicated nature that maybe some of the Rothschilds are, maybe some of them are philanthropists. Who knows? We don't know everything about them. And
that's right.
If we did find something out about that, what a conspiracy theorist would say is probably make some sort of justification about why they're still bad when they're doing philanthropy, or like Bill Gates's philanthropy, right? They say they're always trying to sterilize loads of populations with the vaccine. It's like, why can't he just be doing philanthropy? That's what the guy's probably doing. So,
that's right. Yeah. So it's a heuristic they use, right? It's either you're bad or you're good. So there's really no in between. So it's this idea of the fallacy of the excluded middle, right? So there's nothing in the middle. It's either both extremes, right? And the QAnon one, I just can't wrap my head around it, right? So for those who are not initiated in this conspiracy, right? So Q is supposedly, I guess, one person or maybe a group of people in higher, positions in politics, and they are shadowy characters that are just trying to out the pedophiles and the no-gooders in politics and in business, right? And Q tends to put out these cryptic messages. And for me, it's almost in tune with what psychics use, right? This cold reading type of skill, right? So you put something as general as possible out in the stratosphere and have people kind of, just pick and choose and basically create meaning from it. And even if what you're saying is not true, it's broad enough for someone to justify its meaning, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's a really good way to describe it. The cold reading thing. Yeah, it's exactly that. And I also want to say this is just a very recently interesting topic to me and Ricky Green is the idea of a meta conspiracy. So basically, there's been this information coming out recently. I'm sure lots of your listeners know about the Russian misinformation that's been in the news and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. The IRA. The Internet Research Agency.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So basically what they're doing is pushing certain conspiracy theories online, supposedly to sow, discord and ideological differences, to bring them to the surface, essentially. And it's actually, there's been some research done recently. I can't remember the group though, I need to look it up. But basically there's evidence that Roger Stone, who was in the Trump, one of the people in the Trump campaign in 2016,
that's right.
who recently went to prison. I think he might be out now on bail or something. Yeah.
No, I think the president pardoned him just recently. A few weeks ago.
Okay, so he's been linked to this misinformation campaign, right? Which is essentially pro-Trump. So it's to help support for Trump. The idea here is that they've been using conspiracy theories to basically make Trump supporters just support Trump and not be able to lose the support for Trump because they see it as this kind of moral crusade, right? One of the examples of this could be QAnon, right? They're saying there is this link to, it could have been promoted by the Trump campaign to basically show Trump, of course, as this, moral hero that even though he's being accused of this horrible stuff, it's because of the, the horrible swamp people that are all pedophiles and that need to be outed by Trump, right? And it really reminds me of this quote by Goebbels, the Nazi guy in Nazi Germany, which is accuse your enemies of that which you are guilty yourself, basically. Something like that is the quote. And it really reminded me of that, which is basically like, oh my God, maybe there is this meta conspiracy, which is basically conspiring to use a conspiracy.
That's right.
In order to, basically maintain the support for Trump and never let it go, Wow,
that's interesting. I feel that's why a lot of Trump supporters just can't wrap their heads around the fact that Trump actually lost, right?
Yeah.
So in their world, right, in their simulation that Q has created for them, right, Trump can't lose this election, right? Because he's the moral crusader, like you said, and his job is not done yet. We haven't seen a parade of politicians and businessmen, chained and handcuffed, and,
exactly
told to, line up and file into prison because they're pedophiles or, they have, these hidden bad agendas, right?
Exactly.
Wow,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. The
and
big event hasn't happened
the
yet.
big
Yeah.
event hasn't happened, right? The reckoning hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And it's just sad because the president is actually using this. He's still using this to actually raise money. So after the election, he's raised I think close to like $200 million off of people's I guess fears of pedophiles and evil
Exactly.
people in business.
Yeah.
It's
So
it's kind of sad. It's
it's
sad.
like he's found out how to tap into
He
conspiracy theories
has
as a
he
grifter,
has
right? He's a
he
conspiracy
has.
theory grifter in that way, and
Wow.
it's actually really intelligent when you think about it.
It
If that
is.
is true, you know.
Hey, it is. It is. It is. I
Yeah.
mean,
I hate to give him credit.
I don't envy him for it, but
Mm,
he's yeah, actually we're not going to get
definitely.
into politics here.
Cool. Sure.
So
Yeah.
so is it that the belief in these cockamamie theories, is it just a way for us to, I guess, allay our fear? Is it a cry for help basically? That's what I'm trying to say in a
I would
way?
say, yeah, I would say yes. I
Hmm.
mean, I've got a friend that, without going into too much detail, I really do think it's a way of, crying for help. Yeah, like getting attention,
Mm.
and I don't mean that they don't necessarily believe it. I think they do genuinely believe it. But I think at the same time, yeah, some of this is like, everyone look at me, I've got the answer to all of this, I'm unique or whatever,
Yeah.
whether they know that they're doing that or not. I really think there is this, like, not necessarily attention seeking. So yeah, like you said, cry for help, you know,
Yeah.
just trying to reestablish yourself as a person, your identity, right? Like, look, I'm
Yeah.
a person and I'm worth something because I have this enlightened knowledge that no one else has. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So
Mhm.
you touched on uniqueness, right? And this is
Mhm.
actually a very important concept when it comes to conspiracies, right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
this idea that I'm in the know, quote unquote, right? And I have the answers to what's really going on, right?
Mhm.
Randomness can't be attributed to most of these things. There's actually something else, right?
Mhm.
In the background. So there's this Geppetto type character pulling the strings of society, right? Telling
Mhm.
us how to think and what to do, right?
Mhm.
But if you really think about it, in my opinion, it's actually just a lack of imagination, right? So how can you, one person out of 7 billion people, have the answer, right? And it
Mhm.
actually happens to be the right answer. I mean, the odds are just not in your favor. How come
Mhm.
they can't really ascertain that?
So because it's selective, they don't think in that way. So what we do know is that it's also linked, which I think is really appropriate in terms of uniqueness as well, is this individual narcissism. These people
Mm,
who are like, they actually feel vulnerable, so they have to reinstate their self-worth, and a way of doing that is to show how unique they are as a person, right? So whether that's true or not, whether that's irrational or not, is irrelevant. What they're doing in that scenario is trying to, in an emotional way, reestablish that they have worth. They are important. They're a person that deserves to be distinctive compared to everyone else. And on that, I think it's also a protective mechanism of how to not be persuaded out of believing the conspiracy, because what the feeling of uniqueness does is you believe it because it's unique information, right? So then what happens is you try to argue with a conspiracy theorist and you say, do you not realize that there's all of this scientific consensus and you're the only one that thinks this? All that does is reinstate why they believe that in the first place, because you're showing them that yes, they are unique for believing that. So then they're going to double down on it, right? Because they're getting satisfied for what they wanted, which is to display this uniqueness. So I think with the uniqueness one, it's a really strong predictor just because it's helpful for them. It's a real self-serving logical thing, which is basically, yeah, how can you believe this? You're so unique. Yes, I am unique. That's why I believe this. It's just this circular logic. So I
wow.
think that's a big one there. Yeah.
Wow. Interesting.
Mm.
Wow. So a minute ago, I said we shouldn't get political, but I'd say
It's
we have
impossible.
to. It's impossible, right? Right. So actually, let's get a bit politically incorrect, right? So now, is
Sure.
it safe to say that people with conservative dispositions are more susceptible to conspiratorial thinking? So I mean, the global warming issue is actually an example of this, right? So the
Mm.
people I know, and again, this is anecdotal, but the people I know who are conservatives tend to, disagree with this idea of a warming climate, at least
Yeah.
anthropogenically caused global warming, right?
Yeah.
So are you more susceptible to conspiracy theories if you're a conservative? Let's not sugarcoat
Mm.
it.
So my short answer is I think yes.
Mm,
But but I don't want to say that as a value judgment. I'm not saying, that.
Hey, we're not making value judgments here. We're just social commentators. We're social commentators.
Just going to cover myself there. But what I would say is there's a number of factors that could contribute to this, right? Which is that, so conservative ideology and left-wing ideology, they embody different concerns about the world, different motivations and different kind of foundations of their morality. So while, for example, a conservative would value loyalty, a left-wing person wouldn't really give a crap about loyalty that much, as long as it's the kind of moral thing or whatever. But without getting too much into that, we do find that right-wing ideology, when we measure that as again controlling for that or accounting for that effect, we do find that right-wing ideology positively predicts conspiracy beliefs pretty much in all of our research, right? But that's not to say that, again, this is based on these foundations of the ideologies, right? It could be that conservative ideology, perhaps because of, for example, this loyalty component, that maybe conservative politics in the partisan sense, so being used in a political way, maybe it's being used in conservative parties more than it is in left-wing parties. And this might be because left-wingers might be more likely to call out immoral things, even if it means going against loyalty, right? For example, whereas conservatives might think, okay, this is pretty immoral, but I'm going to win the election, so I think this is worth just going along with. Yeah, sure, Trump is going to kill all the pedophiles, that kind of thing. So what I would say, again, to reiterate, it's not about necessarily the ideology itself, but I think it might be how it's being used in the system, in the world, in our political systems, essentially. But that being said, there is a lot of research about how conservatives respond more kind of in a reactionary way to feelings of existential dread, or they tend to have this need for order, which is a bit higher than in left-wing people. These kind of components do seem to, on their own, link to conspiracy beliefs, aside from ideology. So it may be also these components that, for some reason, the motivations in conservatives may mean that they are more susceptible. But again, it may be a link between how the system is interacting with those, motivations that they're concerned with in a kind of indirect way, is what I would say there. Yeah.
So I think this puts us in a good segue to this idea of cultural orientation, right? So according to your papers, we talk about vertical or horizontal individualists and vertical or horizontal collectivists, right? So the vertical individualist would be more of your libertarian type, right? So this idea that the individual is autonomous and the individual is the bedrock of society, right? And inequality is just one of the facts of life, right? And there's not that much we can do about it, right? So on the other spectrum would be the horizontal collectivist, right? So this would be more of like your Bernie Sanders type individual, right? That says, you know who Bernie Sanders is, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So this idea that the individual is part of a collective, right? And we need to strive as a society to alleviate inequality, right? So how does this put you in line to be more conspiratorial as opposed to not being conspiratorial? Can we talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the truth is we don't know yet. So the research on cultural orientation is literally, it's only been coming out this year. So there was a big paper that came out recently that's been going on since last year, where they've looked at basically the kind of cultural values associated with conspiracy beliefs. It's quite complicated. It seems to be maybe some things about power, but it's kind of too much to go into now. But on that of individualism and collectivism, what me and Ricky have found is that vertical individualism seems to be what positively predicts belief in at least COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So the idea
maybe global warming too, right?
Yes, possibly global warming as well. Yeah. So basically, the idea that we've been pushing, that again, like I said, we've not directly researched this, but it would make sense to the research we found before. Basically, it's mediated or explained by lower feelings of powerlessness in vertical individualists, right? So what we were saying was perhaps the fact that you feel like you're autonomous means that you do garner this positive feeling from autonomy, but at the same time it means that you don't feel like you can intuitively rely on your fellow citizens or the people in your social network. So therefore you kind of have less power to to basically gain from your social environment, and therefore
Wow.
you feel powerless. And we know that powerlessness leads to conspiracy beliefs for what I discussed before about lack of satisfied motivations, powerlessness being that unsatisfied motivation, right? Collectivists, on the other hand, that is not linked at all to conspiracy beliefs whatsoever. COVID-19 ones, I should say. And the idea here is because we were saying that actually horizontal collectivists have higher feelings of power. So the idea there is that they may again be able to alternatively garner feelings of collective support from their community, and therefore they feel powerful. Now they don't have to explain their situation with this kind of compensatory reach out to a conspiracy theory to explain their environment, their situation.
Wow, that makes perfect sense, right? So a vertical individualist would think, okay, I'm powerless to I guess affect these overarching, these grand narratives, right? Like global warming, because I'm just one person, right? But
exactly.
On the flip side, the collectivists would say, okay, you know what, we're in this together, right? So it's possible to actually solve the problems of a global pandemic or global warming, right?
Exactly. And these, again, to reiterate, these are senses of powerlessness or senses of power. So whether that translates into the real world, we don't know yet. But the truth is, these are the feelings that they have. And of course, conspiracy beliefs are beliefs. They're not necessarily things you enact, although there's, of course, downstream consequences of conspiracy beliefs, which are very scary. But
Wow.
yeah, in this sense, it's the beliefs. Yeah.
Wow, this is mind blowing, right? So yeah, I'd say we've touched on a lot of things, Michael. So I want us to end on maybe a solutionary note, right?
Sure.
So let's say we have an uncle, right, that comes to dinner all the time, and he's one of your conspiracy types, and he always has to connect the dots, right? And by the way, isn't there a word for this? I think it's apophenia, is it? This idea.
I haven't heard apophenia.
Okay, so this idea that everything has to be connected, right? So in psychology, I think it's an early sign of schizophrenia, right? When you find connections in everything. So, okay, going back to our uncle, right? We're at dinner, and because we're polite, we listen to him and we entertain him, right? So how do we, I guess, piecemeal get him to realize that he might be wasting his time, going into these rabbit holes, and some of the things he believes might have pernicious outcomes, right? It might affect his the way he thinks, his physiology, and just his outlook on life. So how do we lay it gently on our uncle to step back?
So honestly, I hate this question because it's so difficult to answer. But no, it's great that you asked it because it's really important. This is the main thing, right? So what we do know is that ostracism, an experimental manipulation of ostracism, leads to higher conspiracy belief. So what I mean there is, if you exclude someone socially, all that's going to do is probably make them believe in conspiracy theories more. There's a whole host of reasons as to why that can be, which I won't necessarily go into. But what I mean by that is, so don't reject what they're saying as something that means that they are morally, that they are a morally bad person, and therefore, if you carry on like this, uncle, I'm going to kick you out of this social situation or whatever. Although that being said, this person may have a whole host of other social aspects that may make them essentially toxic. So, that aside from the conspiracy beliefs, that could be its own issue, which means that you shouldn't necessarily ignore those things. But with the conspiracy beliefs themselves, try not to ostracize them for those beliefs. What I would say is try and get onto their level, right? And what I mean by that is to basically put yourself into their mind, and try and understand why they might be saying these things. And in that process, what you can do is actually understand the moments where there are things where you don't necessarily agree with, right? So we all know that the governments do horrible things, that they have factually done them in the past, and it's not a conspiracy theory. We all know that. And that's actually a really important thing to get across to them, because one of the issues is that they can create these straw man arguments, which is that this is why they call you all sheeple, right? Is because they'll say, you all believe everything that you've heard, right? So a good way to start is to maybe make clear things that you don't believe, on the official narrative, because that they're not true, and maybe, one that I often say is, this is a conspiracy theory that I believe in, so ones that I'll say is the Russian misinformation, that kind of thing. Technically, that's a conspiracy theory in some ways, right? So what I mean, by that is to get on their level is a really good one. Aside from that, this is a really annoying answer because it's not very satisfying, but really just try and support them, because like I said, it's about motivation. So often the reason why they're doing this is because they've been lonely, they've been bored, they are anxious, they are, dreading their life at the moment, and they might not even realize that. So, maybe in an indirect way that doesn't really attack them, to get them to realize that or to remember that might make them realize that, even if they do believe it or if they don't believe it, the negative effects are what's important, right? And what you don't want them to do is go down this rabbit hole that makes them even more lonely, push people away, makes them a broken record in talking about the same thing over and over again, because that's what really affects their relationships, and that's what can really make them spiral into, more and more negative things. So what I would say is, try, if you can, hang out with them more, try and distract them.
Wow, that's very interesting. So in summary, don't ostracize your uncle, right? Because it'll only exacerbate the situation, right? Loneliness actually exacerbates this situation. And try to steel man this idea of conspiracies by actually, saying you believe in a conspiracy that is actually proven, right? So this idea of Russian disinformation and maybe the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right? So in a way, you're coming down to their level and just, I guess, a bit of empathy, right? You're having empathy with them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And you're showing them that while I can believe in this one conspiracy theory or something that's technically true or something, while I can believe that, my life is not defined by all of these conspiracy theories, which is what you have, Uncle, which is the issue. It's your whole world is conspiracy theories.
Is wrapped around conspiracies.
Yeah. Wow. Exactly. Wow. Yeah. Because it becomes your life, That's the issue.
It does. Yeah. Whew, man, this is awesome.
I'm nearly sweating.
Yeah. I knew this was gonna be cool, but I have so much to run with now. Nice. But Michael, I'd say this was great. Now, if anyone wants to read any of your work, your papers, and they want to get in contact with you, how can they reach out? And again, if they have someone who has fallen into these rabbit holes and they want to get them out, they're worried about their well-being, right? How can they contact you? How can they read about your work?
Yeah, so just basically online, if you Google me, Mikey Biddlestone, that's Mikey, and then Biddlestone, just spell it however you want, you'll get corrected. I'm on ResearchGate, which is my research you can access for free, all of my papers, or Google Scholar as well, you can find my stuff. Or I'm also on Twitter, if you just type in my name, Mikey Biddlestone as well, I'll come up. I tend to not tweet a lot, but when there's really good threads of someone who, again, like you said, talking to a family member and things, I'll definitely be retweeting all of that stuff. I would recommend following Olivier Klein on Twitter for that stuff as well. He's really good, Belgian psychologist. So Twitter basically, or ResearchGate is where I am. Mostly, wow. Mikey Biddlestone.
Great, Michael.
And don't forget to look up Ricky Green as well.
Ricky Green, yes, he was supposed to be with us, but again, he had to, he had to cancel. But
unfortunately,
he's forgiven.
Rules,
he's forgiven. He's forgiven. Well, again, that's all I have. I can't thank you enough for this. This is a very serious situation, serious topic, and I can't thank you enough for actually making the time out to elucidate these truths for us.
No, thank you so much as well. It was a pleasure being on as well. I think it's great to get the message out, talk to anyone I can about it. And I think it's great that you're doing your podcasts on this stuff. Really interesting information.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much. Cheers.